This graph from your textbook shows the media's impact and influence on our foreign policy by serving as an intermediary between the government and the public. The media sees itself as a representative of the public in oversight of what the government does, in exposing corruption and attempting to keep our politicians and policies honest. And that's the government watchdog function that you see there. The media also sees itself as a source of information and analysis for the public as well when the government, our politicians, our bureaucracies, etc., put out their information. And so we see several key or primary roles for the media in politics in general. The media is the public's source for information and increasingly the public's source for opinion as well. This key role is to just translate government policy into things that we here in the public can understand, and by doing so, transmitting the information and the knowledge that we need to keep abreast of foreign policy. This source of knowledge becomes a power for the media as well. And in this way, they can play what I have here called a gatekeeping function. They get to choose what to cover and what not to cover. And in doing so, the media has a powerful role in determining what is important. If they cover it, therefore it's more important. If they don't cover it, less so. And so the stories that we hear, the stories that they focus on, are the ones that they interpret as being more important, more influential. Of course, there are stories that are very important that go around the world every day. But our national media here in the United States tends to focus on our domestic politics and, in a limited sense, our foreign politics as well. And it is their opinion about what is most important that gives them a true power and influence on helping to drive policies, perhaps forcing our policymakers to address certain problems, address certain issues that come from the coverage of news stories. And this is referred to by scholars as an agenda setting power. The media is not just a source of knowledge, it is also a source of opinion. And increasingly, on cable news outlets and in newspapers, we get a lot of opinion on various stories. And so this too allows the media to shape public opinion on foreign policy. I have here straight news does not tell people what to think, but that gatekeeping role is telling them what to think about. And in a way, the agenda setting that the media can do is to also fulfill this idea that you should be thinking about this particular issue. Our focus should be on it as a public. And if our focus is on it as a public, then the focus should be on it from government and politicians as well. And so when the media choose to cover a story, in a way, they are setting a foreign policy agenda for the United States. They are, in a way, influencing public opinion towards that story. Obviously, our interest towards that story. And so then, their coverage and by choosing what to cover, how to cover it, then sets the agenda sometimes for our policymakers by influencing public opinion. Another related power uh, that the media has in foreign policy, public opinion, and maybe shaping policy is called framing. How does the media cover a story? Well, the way that they cover a story is going to influence the way that the public thinks about it. The way that they cover a story is going to influence the way we here in the public discuss it. And ideally, will then lead to our policymakers making decisions that favor the public's view or favors the public's support or lack of support for a particular issue area. One of the problems that is associated with this idea of media gatekeeping, they choose what to cover, and agenda setting and framing how to cover it, is that the media tends to focus on sensational or controversial issues more because that captures people's attention. There is an old adage in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. And this is a representation of the leading story is the one where there is more controversy, more excitement, more sensationalism, perhaps an automobile accident or something like that. I guess that's where the bleeds comes from. And so that process of selecting and highlighting these types of stories tends to shape public opinion in one way or another. But when it comes to foreign policy, the U.S. media's role in framing a story oftentimes follows certain patterns, and I have that at the bottom of the slide. It oftentimes favors the government's position. That is to say, the government and oftentimes rightly serves as a source of information for the media. That doesn't mean that the government can't be using them for their own devices. However, this is the source of expertise, the source of knowledge on foreign policy decisions. And so when they talk to their sources in the government, they're going to get that representation of the government's opinion or position and not necessarily have a counterbalancing idea or story that goes against the government's position. So when it comes to foreign policy, the U.S. media is going to favor the U.S. In the same way it's U.S. centric, we're going to focus on the U.S. side of the story, not just the government's position, by asking, what does this do for the U.S. economy? What does it do for our U.S. security? So on and so forth. A third point or a third pattern goes along with the sensationalism I mentioned before. The framing of foreign policy stories are oftentimes conflict oriented. That is, they're going to focus on the sensational, they're going to focus on fights, they're going to focus on war, terrorist attacks, so on and so forth. Even if they're not here in the United States, we get this immediate wall to wall coverage of some of these instances, not all of them. And then the fourth pattern is that the media often criticized for being superficial and arbitrary. And this is something that some media tends to try to address, but not always. And I'm sure that this is something that you all have witnessed in your viewing of television news or even in print news as well, is that oftentimes the media focuses on a story for a short period of time and then moves away from it. They don't necessarily do follow-up. And what we get oftentimes is the first cut of a news story. And the problem with that is that the first cut of a news story isn't always the truth. There's a lot of underlying factors that we need to learn about. But their immediate interpretation, their immediate analysis is what we then have as a basis for our understanding. And if that is incorrect, based on misassessments or misassumptions, then the public's going to have it wrong too. And so this is a superficial coverage oftentimes. They don't cover things in the long term. Uh, and when they don't, there's not necessarily the analysis or the depth that you truly need to understand the intricacies of foreign policy. And so then, what we get as a result is that this framing oftentimes simplifies issues. And if you're going to use it to try to set an agenda or influence public opinion in foreign policy, you simplify issues to secure that public support. Um, One of the things that we see is that the media is not just a government watchdog, but the media also is used by government. And public officials then create images of the media. The media create images of public officials, but they also collectively create an image of foreign policy and play off one another, which kind of confuses messages and confuses an understanding of the depth of foreign policy, trying to make it simpler. News coverage oftentimes multiplies and cascades down from the president through the administration and permeates through the media. This is where then you have any number of actors trying to influence a story, influence public opinion using the media, not just the administration, but bureaucracies, Congress, Senate, so on and so forth. And in doing so is one way for the president to use the bully pulpit. Public officials do manufacture consent from the media and the public based on false and misleading information. And so this is where you have the media being used or manipulated perhaps by the government. That idea is in a bit in opposition to what the media sees itself as doing. The media sees itself as a government watchdog. This is the media's primary role. They're the ones who are doing oversight of government policy, of our politicians, to make sure that they're perhaps telling the truth, to track down government spending, waste, so on and so forth. And they are our source of information for foreign policy and foreign affairs. And so then, in doing so, they're, you know, framing, they're setting the agenda about what is important and what is not, but they're also covering the sensational, particularly when the government has done something controversial or done something corrupt, so on and so forth. And there are several examples, I just have a few here, where the media has had influence in foreign policy in this government watchdog role. One is the Pentagon's Papers case that exposed the Department of Defense studies of the Vietnam War and the potential for victory. I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture. This was a situation where a researcher for the RAND Corporation, hired out by the Department of Defense, went to Vietnam in the mid 1960s, really before the United States was more fully actively engaged in combat operations. This person was a former Marine. They worked for this research think tank, and they go in, follow the Marines around, and see that the potential for victory isn't necessarily there. At least that's their assessment. Well, the government sits on that opinion, and it's never exposed. And the U.S. got deeper and deeper into conflict in Vietnam. And so this researcher, Daniel Ellsberg, who is sort of very famous for this, goes to his work, Xeroxes this study, and then gives it to the New York Times, and the New York Times publishes it. Well, this is one of the Supreme Court cases that we talked about earlier in the class. The New York Times is sued by the administration and the Supreme Court says, oh no, the New York Times has a First Amendment right, but this whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, goes to jail. Another and current source of exposure continually is WikiLeaks. And this is where government whistleblowers uh, take computer information and give it to this website that exposes government activities or government controversy. And so then WikiLeaks exposed government activities in Iraq and Afghanistan. This was the Bradley Manning case where, and once again, these sites have the freedom of the press to expose these things, but the people who provide that information to them are in prison, like Daniel Ellsberg, like Bradley Manning. He downloaded a lot of information and gave it to WikiLeaks. The State Department cables were one of these as well, back and forth emails about what our diplomats were saying about the countries that they served in and the people that they had contact with. More recently, and I don't have this here, WikiLeaks has exposed more emails of our government officials. CBS News had got a story about the Abu Ghraib prison. This was a prison in Iraq, which became a prisoner of war prison where Iraqi soldiers and insurgents were kept, and photographs and stories were exposed about the ill treatment of those Iraqi prisoners of war. And then Rolling Stone has been a source of news as well in foreign policy. There were stories about so-called kill squads in Afghanistan, stories about drone strikes and their aftermath. There was the General Stanley McChrystal story exposing what a lot of top military leaders felt of President Obama and his leadership in Afghanistan. And so then those would have direct impacts on foreign policy as well. Even though the media sees itself as a government watchdog, it doesn't mean that they're not being used by government as well. And governments know that the media is a gatekeeper, know that the media is a source of information and opinion for the public. And so the government attempts to use the media to not gauge and shape public opinion as well by the information that they give to the media, by the access that they give to the media, by the stories that they leak to the media. All of this is an attempt by the government to frame foreign policy issues in a way that's favorable to the government. And so then the press is doing oversight, but the press is oftentimes also used. I have one example here. Former Bush Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, among others, used alarming tactics regarding threats of terrorism to boost approval ratings. Well, there were in any number of cases terrorist threat levels that were used that people didn't necessarily understand. There was the use of nuclear associated language with Iraq that built support for that war. And the media covered the government side of that story. Press leaks are tools for administrations as well. And so then leaking particular information and then getting feedback from the public based on these stories can help shape foreign policy support within an administration, knowing whether or not the public supports a given strategy or policy or does not, will allow that president to go ahead with their foreign policy or not.